presenting to us. I think just about everybody here, everybody probably knows Kate, but let me just briefly mention a few things. I mean, Kate is really the key person behind driving public employment programs over many years now. I think it was Kate who was the early pioneer in terms of the wonderful, now sadly in decline, community work program, I think, which was an extremely innovative and probably the best public employment approach, in which it's kind of bottom up, community driven, community selecting the projects and so on, and implemented through non-profit organizations with government funding it essentially. Kate is also, as I knew before, but discovered even more when I was a deputy minister involved in this area of things, is hugely respected internationally. And she's the go-to person for the International Labour Organization on public employment programs. She worked at one stage in Greece following the massive crisis there of unemployment and so forth. And she's had a massive amount of international experience in terms of public employment programs. All of this comes on the back of her earlier experience in working for the National Union of Mine Workers on their cooperative projects in Lesotho and in the other sending areas in South Africa. So Kate currently is, I think, the key person in the presidency. She's from TIPS, but seconded, I think, from TIPS into the presidency, if I'm not mistaken. And when we look at the government's current economic recovery and reconstruction program, comments will remember that from the SACP side, we've said that there are two immediate priorities, essentially. The one is to get a major infrastructure program going, which includes not just economic infrastructure, but social infrastructure. And secondly, mass public employment. We've also supported the notion of a universal basic income grant. And when, Kate, when we're looking at the infrastructure program as a party, we're quite concerned about the doability. It's very reliant on private sector investment, very reliant on blended finance, which is the current World Bank sort of thing. And we're very worried that it's going to try to go a sort of Gautrain, e-tolls route in terms of getting infrastructure going. So really, actually, the big thing that appears to be underway in terms of the economic recovery and reconstruction program is what you're busy with, and which I think you're the key person in, and this is this massification of public employment. So we wish well also the infrastructure program, but we're very worried about it. And obviously both programs are threatened by austerity, the macroeconomic austerity. So in the party, we're saying the two big strategic struggles that we're confronting are, on the one hand, against corruption and state capture, but on the other, against this macro austerity, which is going to actually just drive the crisis before the crisis into a deeper crisis. So it's with a lot of interest, we're welcoming you and look forward to having your input. So over to you, Kate. I normally don't make such a long spiel, but anyway, this is my favorite area, as you know, so there we are. Over to you, Kate. Kate, I think you're muted. You are muted.
You'd think I would have had a handle on this by now. Thank you for the introduction. And as you're talking, I'm realizing that maybe I should be saying a little more. I am going to speak about the stimulus. And so I was quickly trying to copy some more slides into the presentation, but we can always do that if there's interest. Let me share my screen. Okay. And am I up? And let's see if slideshow works. Is that up?
It's up. Lovely.
Okay. So we have used this phrase, building a society that works, for the employment stimulus. And it's really trying to speak to two dimensions where we think that public employment and other forms of publicly funded employment, and I'll speak to that also, have a crucial role to play in a society that is also dysfunctional. So our society is dysfunctional at a whole range of levels. And the argument here that I will make, and that I think does underpin the employment stimulus as well, is that public employment and publicly funded employment has a crucial role to play in building a society that works, both by creating employment, but also through the social value that is created in the process. I mean, I don't have to say this, we all know this. Unemployment isn't going away anytime soon. The COVID crisis only deepened an existing reality. It has, however, given new impetus to the need to address the crisis, and in that process, new opportunities. But very briefly, I just want to emphasize just how devastating the impacts of employment are on society. I mean, unemployment has huge social costs. We were actually in the chat before the formal start, people were sharing examples and stories of how this crisis of substance abuse is escalating in communities and the damaging effect that that's happening, and the link of that back to unemployment. And the reality is that unemployment has a wide range of social costs that are costs to the society in all senses of the word. They are costs to individuals, to households, to communities, but they're also very real costs to the fiscus. So unemployment, the negative social impacts of it ripple right through the society. There are economic costs too. You know, long-term unemployment is recognized as eroding productivity in a society. And given the scale of long-term unemployment that we have, that becomes a really serious systemic issue. People either don't, if they never work, they don't develop, or if they have worked, they lose some of the skills and capabilities associated with participation in employment, whether that's formal employment or self-employment. We also don't calculate the deadweight loss of unused labor. I mean, labor has value. Please, this is a Communist Party meeting, the labor theory of value. You know, labor has value, and we're leaving that value on the table. We're leaving it unused. It's a strategic national asset with which we could be transforming our world, and yet it is unutilized and underutilized to a chronic extent. I'm just getting used to the Zoom shifts here. Are the slides moving, by the way?
Yes, they are.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, that's sometimes a problem. So also just to start by reflecting on the meaning of work in society and why it matters. And this goes in part to what we will also discuss later is the relationship to other forms of, well, to forms of social protection. That work has particular meaning in society. It has meaning to the individuals, to the community, but it also has meaning attributed to it in the society as a whole. So yes, the income certainly matters, but participation in work is about more than that. You know, part of the social compact, if you like, at the level of every household is the expectation that people contribute to the best of their ability. That people contribute to the household. And when people feel that they are not contributing to the household, they feel excluded, they feel marginalized, and they feel undervalued. I mean, in focus groups that were held in a review that I was doing of a program with unemployed youth, what was fascinating is how often what was articulated is that because I don't contribute to my household, I don't have a voice. When things happen, when crucial events happen, when there's a death, when there's a birth, when there's a, I don't have a voice because I don't contribute. So this, you know, this deeply held notion in households, in communities, in the society, that your contribution contributes to your value. In our context, and given the way in which employment is understood, work is a crucial part of how people feel they add value. Economic participation also marks transitions to adulthood. It's part of the social construction of masculinity in particular. Now we can argue about the forms that takes, but it doesn't make it any less real. That being dependent on other people in the household erodes people's sense of adulthood and in many instances, people's sense of masculinity. And that has a whole range of toxic implications for our gender violence situation and for gender relations more generally. Crucially, the workplace, but also for the self-employed, the marketplace, provides networks beyond the family. It provides multicultural exposure. It's a critical component of taking people beyond the belief systems even of the household and exposing them to other cultures, to other religions, to other ways of seeing the world, to information. It's a crucial melting pot, if you like. The workplace has also been a driver of gender equity. The gains in gender equity globally have not come from struggles within the household. They have come from struggles within the workplace, within the world of work in its different forms, have been crucial in struggles for gender equity. And economic participation builds capabilities. It builds life skills, it builds self-discipline, it builds teamwork, creativity, mutual accountability, collective organization. And this is the case, yes, even in quite toxic workplaces that are top-down, that are not the most conducive places in the world. This is also where solidarity is forged. So, you know, in all kinds of different ways, whether in a co-op or in a Fordist factory, economic participation builds a range of capabilities that the society as a whole benefits from and that the society as a whole needs. The bottom line of my argument here is that employment matters too much to society to leave to markets alone. So we tend to see the employment numbers and employment issues as an economic issue, as an economic policy issue, but it's crucially a social policy issue. It has crucial social policy implications. The recognition that employment matters too much to leave to markets alone is actually the basis of commitments to full employment, which I would argue have been honored mainly in the breach, despite the fact that they're still there in all these international commitments. We forget that post-war to the 1970s, full employment was the overriding goal of economic policy. So all other components of economic policy were subsidiary to the goal of full employment. And in the developed world, in that period, unemployment was largely held under 2%. Since then, however, and this is a quote, the concept of systemic failure as a cause of unemployment has been replaced by sheeting the responsibility for economic outcomes onto the individual. And ain't that the truth? If we look at our discourse, we really see this from a commitment to full employment to a focus on employability. And employability is a function of individual attributes, regardless of the levels of labor demand in the wider economy. So we see this all the time, that we have to focus on making our people more employable in a context where there is no labor demand. It doesn't really matter how, you know, we augment skills and whatever important as that is in its own right. But nevertheless, our fundamental problem is a deep structural inequality, deep structural unemployment, and very low levels of labor demand across the spectrum, particularly for unskilled labor, but across the spectrum. And the discourse is very much that if you can't get a job, then it's your job to become an entrepreneur. So the default is that the poor must self-employ their own way out of poverty on market terms. And policy tends to be oriented to assisting individual poor people to augment their skills or to better place themselves to employ their own way out of poverty. Addressing the systemic issues is not front and center in the discourse. So the poor must employ their own way out of poverty on market terms, maybe with a microloan at commercial interest rates, regardless of the structural constraints. And the reality is that there are very real structural constraints, both to growth and employment creation, but also to entrepreneurship. You know, we have a highly centralized economy in which most of the basic goods that are used in poor communities are mass produced in the core economy. So in other parts of the world and in other parts of the developing world, the easiest entry point for new entrepreneurs is to make and sell the goods that they use on a daily basis and that they know that their neighbors need. The problem in South Africa is almost everything in that basket of goods is mass produced in the core economy. And it's extremely difficult. It's not impossible, and there are opportunities and avenues, and people are being very creative about finding those. But that doesn't mean we should overlook the deep structural constraints that limit the returns to that and that limit the pathways in that regard. So this notion of sheeting responsibility for economic outcomes onto the individual is very evident in the notions of dependency that we see in the social grants debate. You know, that firstly, people shouldn't be dependent in the first place, but they should be weaned off grants as quickly as possible and made employable and made into entrepreneurs as quickly as possible. Now, obviously, yes, we want people to have pathways into better economic outcomes, but nevertheless, underpinning the discourse is this idea of sheeting responsibility onto the individual, with a focus on poverty as a result of individual characteristics and failures rather than structural issues and barriers. In the process of this discourse, primacy is given to markets in determining social outcomes. That's what we do. It is very prevalent in the discourse. And the reality is that our social outcomes are being held hostage to these market dynamics. The kinds of social issues that were highlighted in that earlier slide, from the issues affecting communities, of substance abuse, of gender-based violence, of poor nutrition, stunting, all of these issues that are treated as social issues are deeply rooted in a context in which we've given primacy to markets in determining these social outcomes. And the critical question is, what is the role of the state and of society in shaping markets instead? Now, of course, we know the state has many instruments with which to enable and shape employment outcomes. And as I often argue, you know, yes, plan A is that the economy delivers decent work. That is plan A. Let's do it. Let's make it happen. Macro policy, industrial policy, development finance, public investment, labor market policy, active labor market policies, incentives, and more. There is a panoply of instruments that the state has at its disposal to shape markets in ways that deliver employment outcomes and create decent work. All of those and many more enable and shape those outcomes. The issue is, though, that when plan A isn't working, societies need a plan B. And plan B is publicly funded employment. And it's an instrument that the state has at its disposal, that it should use when needed in the interests of society as a whole. So again, plan A is the economic recovery. I wish I felt more inspired by the overall economic recovery strategy at the moment. And for years and decades, in fact, our economic recovery or our economic growth agenda has stumbled and is not delivering the outcomes that we all want. It remains the absolute priority to get that right. But while we get that right, my God, we need a plan B because things are falling apart. So I'm in the plan B camp. I don't for a moment suggest that public employment programs are more important than these other things, or that public employment programs can solve systemically a failing and non-growing and non-equitable and economy. Yes, the focus of our policy responses has to be on plan A, but I am an equally strong proponent of the fact that when plan A is not working, we need a plan B, and this is plan B. So, public employment programs. This is actually a remarkably versatile development instrument. It's an instrument in which the value of labor is unlocked to create social value, even when markets don't enable that. Because the fact of the matter is that even when labor doesn't have a market value, when it can't be sold on the market, it has a social value and it can create social value, and it can also create economic value. So how are we unlocking that? How are we using that as part of our orchestra of instruments to address the challenges we face? And what is the scope? If you look at the history of public employment and public works over the years, starting, well, probably not starting, but, you know, maybe the pyramids were a form of public employment program based on slavery, non-optimal. So, you know, if we look across time, there are many instances where the state, if you like, has utilized or unlocked forms of labor in various contexts of crisis. Those examples, the development outcomes aren't always optimal. I mean, public works programs can be absolutely dire, and there are plenty of examples of those. They can be exploitative, they can have appalling conditions of work, they can create very little social value. That's a policy choice. That's a design choice. It's not inherent in the instrument. And it's important to understand those choices. So what is the scope to optimize the development outcomes from this instrument? And what is the scope to innovate? So innovation isn't new. If we look back, there are fabulous examples in history. The New Deal in the USA in the 30s is best known for the big dams and the big freeways. One forgets that at the time, the US did not have freeways joining north and south or east and west. We forget that. And right now in South Africa, we actually do have freeways joining north and south and east and west. So we're not in quite the same space as the US was at that time in terms of infrastructure. But what is less well known is that they didn't just build dams and freeways. They also supported artists and writers, amongst many other things. So they employed authors, playwrights, and poets. They used more than 6,000 writers to produce the very first travel guides for 48 states with geography, history, culture, maps, drawings, and pictures. They used geographers, historians, artists, writers, and commissioned those travel guides for 48 states. They also supported murals in hospitals and post offices in all kinds of public buildings. They commissioned artworks. So these are all ways of supporting different contributions to society and recognizing the different forms contributions to society take. I'm sure many of you are familiar with India's difficult to acronymize Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which is the world's first employment guarantee. Now, for me, the critical thing about this is that it's a crucial mind shift. You know, the right to work is embedded in a lot of these international documents, but it is essentially a right to work when work is available in markets. Okay, if there's no work available in markets, you don't have a right to work. India has changed that in its rural areas. It's a limited right, but it's a right nevertheless, to a right to work when work is needed. So the Indian state guarantees up to 100 days per annum on request. I mean, what is incredibly ambitious about this program, and they seem to have pulled it off, I don't think we could, to be honest, is that you are entitled to be employed. If you lodge a claim for employment at your local municipal office, they have to employ you within 15 days, or they are responsible for paying a form of income grant at the level of the wage if they can't find employment for you. And what is quite clever about the incentive framework of it is that if they employ you, national government pays the costs of that, the wage and other costs of that. If they don't get it together to employ you, it comes off their own local budget. And there's a strong incentive to get their acts together and create employment. And at first, when this was introduced, it was chaotic and there was a mad scramble, and often the work was not well thought out. But it's how many years old now? It's about 15 years old now, if I'm not wrong. And it has been institutionalized in ways that the equivalent of local wards actually is the level at which it operates, have what are called shelf projects that they are able to expand and contract as labor demand changes. And also the patterns of labor demand have become very clear. It's non-seasonal labor. And right now, over 60 million people participate in this program annually. 60 million people. I mean, in India, you know, these numbers you can't kind of equate them with anything in our space, but nevertheless, 60 million people. And what is fascinating to me about this program is how in India, they used the program to improve labor standards in the marketplace. So there's a recognition that labor standards in rural India are appalling. They're still pretty appalling, but they have improved as a result of the program. Labor standards are appalling, and they actually used conditions in this program to put pressure on market-based labor standards. So by paying a minimum wage, Narega has led to increases in agricultural wages in certain states because workers now have a choice. They don't have to work at virtually slave labor rates on the farms. They have an alternative. And yes, it's only 100 days a year, but it is an alternative. It creates an alternative. It gives them bargaining power. And agricultural wages have gone up. It's been highly controversial. And of course, farmers have complained bitterly. One of the unintended consequences is there's a bit of a shift towards mechanization. These are the dynamics that play themselves out. But also by paying equal wages, Narega has contributed to closing the gender wage gap because women have got used to being paid equal wages in that context. It's no longer taken for granted that they are not, and they are emboldened to organize and to demand equal pay in market-based work, and they too have an alternative. So it's a critical example of providing a right to work, providing a mass scale public employment program, gives people alternatives for labor. I mean, you know, with my old trade union hat on, I mean, you know, the reserve army of labor is a critical factor undermining the power of labor. An employment guarantee of this kind has the potential to erode the erosive power of the reserve army of labor. So, you know, these are important strategic considerations. And in India, this has certainly been used as an instrument in the fight against working poverty. And yes, it has its problems. It is not a perfect program, and certainly Modi is not a, well, I say Modi is not a big fan of it. He did try to close it down initially, but it had such popular support that he couldn't. And now he's looking at replicating it in urban areas. And then we come to South Africa, looking at innovation. And, you know, we have lots of challenges and problems, but we don't always recognize where we've actually done amazing and inspiring things. The fact of the matter is that South Africa has quite an incredible track record in terms of public employment and in terms of innovation in this space. The environmental programs are genuinely fantastic programs. They're really good programs for the environment and also for communities and for participants. They were streets ahead of the game. They were at least a decade or two ahead of the game, and the rest of the world is catching up in the context of climate change. And these programs are being used and considered as benchmark programs around the world. We were also one of the first countries in the world to look at work in the social sector through a public employment lens. Historically, it's usually been building roads, it's usually been infrastructure. Even in India, the focus is on infrastructure, environmental infrastructure. But South Africa introduced public employment programs in the care sector. And this is also not widely recognized, but in the period of HIV denialism is when the Department for Social Development introduced a public employment program supporting home-based care that was primarily supporting HIV-affected households and child-headed households. And it was brave policymaking in a context in which the Department of Health was not doing this and was not taking this on. We have fabulous programs in early childhood development that are trying to close the gap there. Yes, they're underfunded and the wage levels are poor. The fact of the matter is that huge social innovation has taken place in that space. On the left at the bottom, those are homeless people in the Western Cape, and eThekwini has a similar program where public employment programs are being used to integrate homeless people and provide employment opportunities for homeless people. On the right there, yes, we do have a strong focus on infrastructure in EPWP. It's also had a very strong focus on gender equity, on ensuring participation of women. So across a whole range of fronts. Then the community work program, which Jeremy mentioned, has tried to embed community-driven approaches. That hasn't always been effectively embraced within COGTA, unfortunately. But the fact of the matter is that we actually have a really strong track record in this area, and there's a lot to be proud of. So, bringing us to the present. The reality is that there is no shortage of work to be done to solve the problems in our society. And so the question is, how can we continue to allow a shortage of work to be one of our society's defining features? There's a simple mechanism to close this gap in a context of low labor demand, and it is public employment. Right now, we're in reconstruction mode, although COVID is not over, but the mantra is that it's not about recovery to what was, it's about transformation to what's next, that this is an opportunity to build back better. Let's hold on to that. And in the context of public employment, what does that mean? It was in that context and against that backdrop that a group of us were asked to design an employment stimulus, the presidential employment stimulus, called Building a Society That Works, and that was announced about 3 weeks ago now by the president. The employment stimulus actually includes a number of components. So public employment is just one component. There's also a strong component of job retention in schools, job retention in cultural institutions, job retention in sports entities. There are a range of programs of job retention within the employment stimulus, saving jobs. And there are also direct grants to support livelihood and enterprise opportunities in publicly funded ways. So for example, there is the biggest stimulus the creative and cultural sector has ever had is part of the employment stimulus. It's 500 million that is being issued against calls for proposals from the sector, where the sector itself is being asked to come to the party and identify ways of using art and culture and heritage to create jobs and to create opportunities for themselves in the context of the crisis. 74,000 small farmers are being supported. The ECD sector are getting startup grants. There are a range of different components that support self-employed people within the employment stimulus. But in today's session, I'm going to focus on the public employment component. This is the final allocations. We had a hell of a curveball at the last minute. I'm not going to go into all of these and I'm not going to go into the details, but we had been allocated 19 billion in the special adjustment budget in June, and we're told that we had to spend it in year or lose it. So there was a mad scramble. There was a month where all of the money was going to go to SAA and everything was put on hold. A legal challenge prevented that from within Treasury. It's been a hell of a journey. We had allocated 800 funded jobs for in-year to an amount of 15 billion. It was hard to spend the whole 19 billion, and we had motivated that the balance should go to social grants because at the same time, we were motivating for the extension of the special COVID grant. The day that the president announced the employment stimulus, we were told that a component of the employment stimulus would be cut, so that the 800,000 that were announced were cut the next week, only down to 694,000, so not too terrible, and back to 12 billion in order to fund not just part of the extension of the grants, but the whole cost of the extension of the grants. It seemed to me to be a pity to trade off one allocation for the poor with another allocation for the poor. I would have thought we could have found that 4 billion somewhere else. But anyway, so I can go into the detail of what is in the stimulus if people are interested, but I'm going to focus on particular dimensions here. So what does it mean to build back better in public employment programs? What does it mean? We have EPWP, we have the CWP. Many people understand EPWP to be a program, but in fact, it's a collection of programs. EPWP is the coordinating mechanism. How do we build on the strengths of what exists? How do we build back better? And we have emphasized that this is building on what has gone before, and it doesn't replace or displace anything that exists currently, but was an opportunity to look in new ways at how to augment and how to create additionality. And some of the principles that were used reflect areas where, yes, EPWP and CWP have their strengths, they also have their weaknesses. And these were the kinds of issues that we were trying to take the opportunity for a bit of a reset. The first is the issue of mainstreaming. So we all know about fiscal constraints, and what's happened in EPWP over the years is that departments have been exhorted to mainstream public employment by finding pockets in their budgets that can support employment. In other words, to optimize their budgets for employment creation. The trouble is, not all government departments and not all government public bodies can do very much in this regard. And what it has led to is firstly unfunded programs. So a lot of EPWP comes out of carving out bits and pieces of budget from within budgets that haven't got an allocation for employment. And what it means is that those tend to be micro projects. They tend not to have much dedicated management. They tend to be short term. They tend to be done on the side of the core mandate of the relevant department. And as a result, outcomes aren't always optimal. And the argument here is, if we want public employment to be meaningful, it needs to be funded. You know, it can't be a residual within a budget. This idea that there are unallocated portions within budgets well, the limits of that have been reached. The next key thing we were trying to influence was a shift from what public officials themselves referred to in an EPWP evaluation process as stop-start projects to more programmatic approaches. Again, the stop-start projects are a function of the funding model, so that the municipal incentive grants provide relatively small envelopes of funding to municipalities. The average duration of EPWP projects in the provincial incentive grant is 8 full-time equivalents. Now, that's all EPWP speak if you're not familiar with it. Effectively, what it means is that the average size of a project is very small, and although they're calculated as full-time equivalents, in practice, 8 full-time equivalents is more often 40 people employed for 20 days. And that just doesn't do a lot for anyone, you know? It's a burden on the managing department because it's a stop-start project. It doesn't provide a huge benefit to participants, but each one of those 40 people for 20 days is counted as a job opportunity. And that has happened because of intense pressure on numbers. And public officials have tried to respond to that pressure, but it's created a situation where some of the public perception of public employment is of these short-term, stop-start, not very satisfying, impossible to evaluate, and creating relatively thin social and public value. And so we wanted to push for more programmatic approaches that allow for better management, better monitoring and evaluation, better social value creation, better outcomes. Then there's the issue and the perception of low value work. And I know that you know, the introduction of the national minimum wage created a real dilemma in EPWP, because if EPWP had aligned with the national minimum wage, it would have meant a significant reduction in the number of opportunities created. And there's a really difficult trade-off there. The fact is that the EPWP wage currently is 53% of the national minimum wage, and that gap is just too big. And it has reinforced the idea amongst the public and unfortunately amongst participants that this work isn't valued by society. It isn't valued by the society, and that's why it is low paid. And as a result, that actually undermines some of the value of participation in work, which is self-respect, respect from the community, a sense that you're creating value, all of those kinds of things. And interestingly, we did, as part of this process, we did a review of all EPWP programs and the wage levels. And what we found is that most programs have gravitated upwards towards the minimum wage. They're not all at the minimum wage. However, all infrastructure programs pay the bargained rate. That's been the case for a long time. Many people don't realize that, but it is true. Infrastructure programs pay the bargaining council rates, but other programs have gravitated upwards so that actually even CWP doesn't pay the EPWP minimum rate, although it's one of the lowest paying programs. So this issue, we'll talk about how that's manifest in the employment stimulus. We also have seen that, yes, the labor theory of value, it's a bit thin on, yes, labor creates value. Marx was a little bit thin on the role of management in the creation of value. I'm afraid what we have seen in both co-ops and public employment programs is that management matters, and that labor creates value best when management is good, whatever form that management takes, whether it's self-management or bottom-up management or whatever. The point is management matters, and so does more skilled work. And so the integration of more skilled work and more of a focus on effective management in these programs is key to quality outcomes. The stimulus has another stab at labor intensity, which we can talk about, and it has another stab at augmenting the scope for community-driven and whole-of-society approaches. So what I'm going to do now is just talk briefly about some of the examples of this in the stimulus. And I'm going to start with a component of the stimulus that was cut the week after it was announced. This is a pity. However, there's a real commitment to this component. It was meant to be the flagship component of the stimulus. It was cut from the president's speech an hour before because there was such panic about the fact that everyone had just been notified that the stimulus was being cut, the day it was announced. But there is a serious commitment from the parties to this, and it does look now like there will be funding for the employment stimulus in the medium term. And we're using this period to do effective and proper planning for a launch of this component in the new financial year. And what this is a focus on what we've termed social employment. And it's a call to the wider society to create work for the common good. It builds a lot on some of the ambitions of CWP that haven't entirely been realized. Word has it that CWP is being transferred into MISA, that the role of nonprofits within the program is being terminated, and that it will become an infrastructure program. So we no longer have, we may no longer have a program that's even meant to be community driven, even though that ambition wasn't entirely realized. So this is an opportunity to, in a sense, this is a phoenix approach to the idea that communities and community actors have a critical role to play in identifying work that serves the common good, and that the state and society should be creating instruments that unlock that agency to create new forms of public value. The strategy has been embedded within the wider social economy strategy in DTIC, and IDC is intended to be the fund manager. The approach is to, so what do we mean by social employment? Well, here are examples. If you ask communities what work is needed in the community to improve the quality of life, you will get these and many other ideas. There are no shortage of ideas of work that can transform communities. As Dr. Seuss put it, the things you can think up if only you try. And this is meant to be an instrument that enables people to try, to imagine, to create, to innovate, to organize. We've seen some of this in COVID. We've seen the social kitchens. We've seen local care. We've seen all kinds of innovation and action. The point is we need a much more robust mechanism through which the society, and within that the state, actually supports this. So whether it's community libraries or social kitchens, urban agriculture, recording social history, community safety, counseling for victims of violence, support to refugees, public interest app design, after-school sports activities, river rehabilitation, converting dumps to people's parks. These are all forms of work. They involve work. They are hard work. They involve work that serves the common good. They need an instrument that enables that work to be recognized as work by the society and as creating social value. In the process, we also want to promote innovation in new forms of public value. There are tired stereotypes about public works that don't actually fit even the current reality very well. Some of them do, unfortunately, but the point is to reimagine what public employment could look like. I love this example of community radio in Bulungula on the Wild Coast, where youth are actively involved in community radio that serves over 100 villages, bringing information, creating local content. They sent a delegation to the National Arts Festival and brought back interviews with artists and audience and participants, bringing the world into Bulungula through the medium of community radio. that needs to be supported, and it can be supported through a community, through a public, a social employment mechanism. It was supported through the community work program before things went a little pear-shaped there. Then in the Western Cape, there's the example of a pilot that has been run using young people to address the backlog of over 1 million title deeds, going door to door with tablets, capturing data, assisting people to upload documents, using blockchain, recording the documents on blockchain. In the process, unlocking assets in the hands of poor people and creating township markets in the process, using a public employment model to do so. Then there's Gauteng, where 750 youth were trained on tablets to undertake surveys of 9 township economies. They mapped and tracked and interviewed every single business they could find, creating a huge database that has been the basis on which Gauteng has developed its township revitalization strategy, an area in which they're really ahead of the pack. These are just examples of digital opportunities. This is not meant to suggest the only form of innovation is digital, but the point is, can we reimagine what public employment could look like? So now let me get to the stimulus. Many of you would have seen the ads. Right now, the Department of Basic Education is recruiting 300,000 school assistants. So within less than a month of the president's announcement, there are 300,000 new opportunities for young people. They are prioritizing graduates, teacher graduates, other graduates, matriculants, and people without matric. So it's across the spectrum of youth. An interesting feature of this is they are paying the national minimum wage. One of the things this has meant is that we have had really good buy-in from SATU. I hope nobody on this call is from SATU and is going to tell me otherwise, but thus far, the fact that this program is paying the national minimum wage has removed what has typically been quite an obstacle to programs of this kind. And in fact, teachers are embracing it and saying, yes, thank heavens, we need this assistance and support. Unfortunately, it had to be designed as an in-year program only, which makes no sense at all. Originally, the concept was for a 1-year program from January, but because the funding all has to be spent in year, it has to start on 1 December and end at the end of March. And yes, of course, we're trying our level best to negotiate that it becomes an ongoing and permanent program with 1-year placements for young people. But this now becomes the single biggest public employment program in the country. CWP was the biggest single program at 240,000, but with 300,000 participants, this becomes the single biggest public employment program. And it's got some really nice features. One of them is the recruitment mechanism, which is that the recruitment is happening through an online platform called sayouth.mobi that is an outcome of the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention. It's what's called a network of networks. It involves a range of participants from Department of Employment and Labour, DHET, and non-state actors. It's hosted in Harambee, and it is a zero-rated data portal that is not just for recruitment, actually. It's a platform for young people that is meant to link them to a range of opportunities. So of course, employment opportunities are front and center, but also it provides access to learning materials if you want to hustle, if you're buying and selling. What are some resources about, other people's experiences, about how to keep a financial diary. There are a range of different things. And similarly, there are training opportunities. And what it does is if a young person registers on the site, it automatically geolocates them and then crowds in opportunities and resources in their area. So where is the nearest labor center? Where is the nearest CEDA center? Where is the nearest, whatever the different, whether it's NGO, state or other, if those support services are registered on the platform, a young person will see the full gamut of support services in their area that they can access. And so even those youth who apply for the 300,000 DBE opportunities and are rejected, because we are expecting about 1 million applicants, even those that are rejected are then held on the network and directed towards other opportunities to support groups, to networks. And it's a free Mobi site. So what we're seeing is, really interesting innovation also in the recruitment process that is also intended to remove any suggestion of patronage in the recruitment process. Okay, so I've just covered the social employment component of the employment stimulus and the DBE program, which is the biggest. There are a range of other programs, existing programs like the EPWP environmental program, the rural roads program, a labor-intensive infrastructure. All of those have had allocations that allow them to expand as well. There are new programs in the cultural sector. There are grant stimuli, if you like, to smallholder farmers, to the cultural sector, to ECD practitioners, to the business process outsourcing sector, where jobs are growing. But I thought what I'd end off with is engaging with some of the debates around public employment. So something we, having argued the case for public employment, some of the response that sometimes comes is, okay, so it's fabulous. Let's support public employment programs instead of grants to avoid dependency. And what I'd like to say to that is not so fast. In the policy debates that we have, we tend to think in binary terms. So it's social grants versus public employment programs. I really want to make a case for these to be seen as complementary mechanisms that both have crucial roles. So right now, we are confronting an argument that says all the 6 million people on the special COVID grant should transition into public employment or they should become entrepreneurs. And my response to that is, yes, scaled up public employment programs can absorb some of those on the special COVID grant. But right now, public employment programs can't absorb all of them. We're talking, yes, 300,000 is now our biggest PEP in DBE. We're talking 6 million people. The 800,000 that we're targeting for, yes, it'll help. But, we were unable to find homes for even, the capacity. There are capacity constraints in scaling up to that level, and there are fiscal constraints. And yet we know from the SALDRU data that without that meager 350 Rand, over 5 million of the people on the grant will fall below the food poverty line. We can't talk in these binary terms. We need both of these instruments. Yes, it will be fabulous if some people on the grant can be absorbed into public employment programs. But the idea that that is going to solve the problem that will be left if we cancel the grant is just not doing the maths. At the same time, yes, we can do better at supporting livelihoods and self-employment. We can, and there's some interesting examples. But saying let the poor self-employ their way out of poverty continues to ignore the structural problems. And what is also often ignored is that we talk about dependency, but what we leave out of the mix is that local economic development in townships and rural areas is dependent on grant transfers and spending from public employment programs. We tend again to individualize this idea of dependency. Actually, the grants and public employment give people independence. What's dependent on those grants and transfers is those local economies and the opportunity for entrepreneurship. Our entrepreneurship house of cards will fall over if the grants are removed. And there's plenty of evidence that shows that. So, this binary notion, oh, we must support entrepreneurship instead of grants, is completely misplaced. The other argument is, well, why don't we just have a big and use the money spent on PEPs to fund the big? Well, my argument would be, we do need a minimum income policy. I would prefer a targeted one to a universal one, but that's a different debate. We do need a minimum income policy, but it's never going to be at the level of even an EPWP wage. So, and people do want pathways into a better life. Employment is about more than just the income, as has been emphasized. It's about structure, networks, capabilities, work skills. All of those are crucial to pathways into employment and self-employment. So can we recognize that what we need is multiple redistributive social transfers of different kinds that contribute to multiple pathways? There is no silver bullet. I support the grants. they're not a silver bullet. I support public employment programs. They're not a silver bullet. And entrepreneurship is not a silver bullet either. Can we start to think in more integrated ways about the interrelationship between these instruments, how we can strengthen the interrelationship, but not try to trade off the one against the other, as just happened in the revised budget? So understanding the way grants and PEPs provide a stimulus from below for employment, for sustainable employment and sustainable local enterprise development. Without the grants and without PEPs, local enterprise development is not going to be so sustainable. So this notion of contrasting the two as alternatives, as I've emphasized, I would argue is leading us down an incorrect path. So in sum, my final slide. I'm arguing that we should move the debate away from these binary choices: grants, PEPs, SME development, entrepreneurship. We need integrated approaches that focus on multiple pathways out of poverty. The more that PEPs can go to scale, providing meaningful work, the less pressure on the social protection system. It's a counter-cyclical thing. It's an interlinked counter-cyclical relationship. So yes, they are linked, but they don't exist as alternatives that need to displace one or the other. Similarly, while minimum income policies are crucial, we cannot allow food poverty at the scale that we currently have it. We as a society, it's untenable. But grants are not enough on their own because of the role of employment in society, that it goes far further than just the income. And we need to offer people these levels of inclusion of different forms. The bottom line, employment matters too much to society to leave to markets alone. And I'll end there, and the joke is on me because I said to Jeremy and Jenny at the beginning, no, I'll never talk for an hour. No, never talk for an hour. And I see that I just did. Back to you, Jeremy and Jenny.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. That was brilliant. And you were less than an hour. You were 2 minutes less than an hour. We could have happily listened to you for another hour. It was wonderful. Fantastic input. What I also failed to mention, Comrade Kate, is that you were also being followed not just on Zoom, but in fact by the majority of followers were watching you on Facebook. At this point, we're in Facebook, and many of them then migrate, because saving data, migrate into the Zoom session. But thank you so much. So, comrades, what we will do as normal is, those who would like to speak, intervene, raise questions,